Beneath crowns of gold and portraits of grandeur lies a hidden history they never taught in school, a world where power corrupted not just absolutely, but intimately. These were not just rulers, they were emperors of excess, monarchs of madness, and sovereigns of scandal whose desires bent courts, broke laws, and rewrote morality. Behind every velvet curtain and jeweled throne was a secret no court chronicler dared publish. Until now. This is 25 royals with the most bizarre sexual practices, and once you see how deep the rabbit hole goes, you'll never look at royalty the same way again. Before we dive headfirst into centuries of royal depravity, take a second to subscribe, not just for the gossip, but for the unsettling truths history tried to bury. Drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila, 3 a.m. in New York. I want to know who else can't sleep tonight and what kind of rabbit hole you're falling into. 1. Caligula, Roman Emperor. If the Roman Empire was a machine of law, conquest, and marble logic, then Caligula was the wrench someone threw into the gears just to see what would happen. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus in 12 CE, he was the golden child of the beloved general Germanicus, and by all accounts, an adorable little mascot on campaign. Soldiers gave him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, after the tiny military outfit he wore as a boy. But by the time he became emperor, at just 24 years old, that name had turned into something else entirely, a warning. His reign, 4 short, chaotic years, remains one of the most infamous in Roman history. Not because he was a failure of leadership, though he certainly was, and not just because he was cruel, though the stories are hard to ignore, but because he blurred the lines between emperor, god, predator, showman, and something else entirely. Something Rome had no category for. Caligula didn't just abuse power, he performed it. Excess wasn't a side effect of his rule, it was the point, and nowhere was that clearer than in the way he treated the people closest to him. Ancient historians, particularly Suetonius and Cassius Dio, describe a palace transformed into a stage. Caligula's sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, were dragged into the center of this theater. The emperor reportedly lavished affection on them in public, praised them with titles usually reserved for consorts, and according to scandalous rumor, claimed rights over them no brother should assert. Whether these rumors were true or just, the Roman Senate's posthumous attempt to discredit a mad ruler is still debated. But their survival tells you everything about how shocking and plausible people found his behavior even in his own time. The palace was said to host lavish, disturbing banquets where noblewomen were selected for the emperor's amusement and noblemen were humiliated at his whim. Senators were invited not as policymakers but as participants in rituals of degradation, forced to observe, to smile, to nod as power played dress-up in the flesh of their daughters, wives, and reputations. There were whispers that Caligula didn't just host orgies, he choreographed them, casting roles, commanding performances, and turning the imperial palace into a place where the boundaries between state, family, and fantasy collapsed entirely. He wasn't just indulging, he was rewriting the rules of empire. The emperor wasn't a servant of the gods anymore, he was one. Caligula demanded temples, priests, and sacrifices in his name. He appeared in public dressed as Apollo, as Venus, as Mercury, gods chosen for their symbolic associations and occasionally their gender-fluid aesthetics. He didn't just challenge Roman morality, he undid it with a smirk. His public relationships weren't any less alarming. He married and divorced with the casual brutality of a man flipping pages in a playbook. One story tells of him spotting a Roman nobleman's wife at a banquet, taking her to another room mid-meal, and returning later only to praise or criticize her performance within earshot of her husband. This wasn't seduction, it was dominance as spectacle, and like all emperors with a flair for fear, He knew the value of unpredictability. Caligula reportedly prostituted members of his own family, turned the palace into a brothel, and replaced policy with parody. He mocked the Senate, openly suggesting his horse be appointed consul, a story often repeated as proof of his madness, though possibly a brilliant act of political contempt. His entire reign seemed designed to test how far reality could bend before it snapped. But here's the twist. Caligula didn't start out this way. His first few months as emperor were filled with public celebration. He pardoned exiles, ended treason trials, and was hailed as a beacon of hope after the brutal reign of Tiberius. Then came a mysterious illness, or perhaps a breakdown, after which everything changed. Whether it was psychological trauma, epilepsy, encephalitis, or sheer unchecked power, something inside him fractured, and the empire watched it happen in real time. When he was finally assassinated in 41 CE by members of his own bodyguard, the Praetorian Guard, even his murder felt like a tragic farce. His death plunged the imperial court into chaos, but no one wept for him. Instead, Rome breathed out. What remains today is a portrait of a ruler who turned absolute power into immersive theatre, where people were both audience and actors, and no one, not even his family, was off script. But if Caligula turned the empire into a stage, his successor would set it on fire, then sing about it. Because following Caligula came Nero, and Nero didn't just act like a god, he wanted to be one, with applause. 2. Nero, Roman emperor. If Caligula blurred the lines between emperor and performer, Nero smashed those lines to dust and danced on the ruins, in costume, under a spotlight, and preferably with an orchestra. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 CE, Nero wasn't supposed to rule an empire, but through a sequence of adoptions, assassinations, and political choreography, mostly orchestrated by his ambitious mother, Agrippina the Younger, he became emperor at the tender age of 16. And for a while things looked stable. He started his reign with moderation. He lowered taxes, banned secret trials, and spoke of restoring senatorial dignity. Philosophers like Seneca guided him. His early decisions were praised for restraint. Rome dared to hope. Then the curtain dropped and the show began. As Nero grew into the throne, he also grew into something stranger, a man who believed not just in divine rule, but in divine performance. To Nero, the emperor wasn't just the head of state, he was the star. His palace became a stage, his court an audience, and his subjects extras in a production that grew more elaborate by the day. And just like Caligula before him, Nero's indulgences weren't private affairs, they were policy. He didn't just host banquets, he orchestrated feasts as festivals, where men and women of the court were expected to attend costumed orgies of sound, colour and motion. The line between statecraft and theatre became indistinguishable. Invitations to these events were less social than strategic. Your presence meant favour, your absence meant suspicion. At the centre of Nero's personal life were a series of relationships that baffled, scandalized, and terrified the Roman elite. He married multiple women, then famously took a different approach entirely. Enter Sporus, a young boy whom Nero had castrated and then married in a public ceremony. Sporus was dressed in the robes of an empress, referred to with female titles, and paraded through Rome as Nero's consort. According to ancient sources, the emperor explained this by saying Sporus resembled his late wife Poppaea Sabina, whom Nero had allegedly caused to die during a violent outburst. Sporus, in Nero's twisted narrative, was not a replacement. He was a reanimation. The wedding wasn't symbolic. It was an official event, complete with witnesses and rituals. The court watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to laugh, cry or cheer. Most did all three, quietly. This wasn't Nero acting out of impulse. It was deliberate, a redefinition of social boundaries wrapped in imperial flair. Nero didn't care if Rome approved. He cared if they clapped. The performative nature of his rule extended into every corner of his personal life. He played the lyre, he sang, he acted on stage. He toured Greece performing tragedies, competing in games where the outcome was always favorable. No one dared to criticize his voice or his acting. Senators sat through hours of his performances, offering forced standing ovations to avoid punishment. To refuse applause was to invite exile, or worse. He even built a massive pleasure palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, complete with rotating dining rooms, ceilings that rained down petals and perfume, and grand halls decorated with mythological tableaus where Nero could play any role he chose. It wasn't just a home, it was a myth engine. But the deeper he spiraled into his own fantasies, the more detached he became from the empire he ruled. When the Great Fire of Rome broke out in 64 CE, rumors spread quickly that Nero had ordered the flames to clear space for a new palace. Whether or not that's true, his behavior afterward, composing songs about the fire, dressing in dramatic robes, and reportedly watching from a tower, cemented the image of an emperor who saw destruction not as crisis, but as art direction. He blamed Christians for the fire, launching the first major persecution of the new sect, and further positioning himself as the divine avenger of Roman order, even as that order cracked beneath his feet. Eventually, the weight of Nero's contradictions collapsed in on him. Revolts broke out across the provinces. The Senate declared him a public enemy, and in 68 CE, just 30 years old, the man who wanted eternal applause found himself alone, hunted, and without a stage. Before his death, Nero reportedly muttered, "What an artist dies in me." He wasn't wrong. He was a tyrant, yes, but a tyrant who believed his cruelty was beautiful, his excess meaningful, and his life a performance the gods themselves were lucky to watch. But if Nero ruled as a playwright of his own tragedy, the next emperor in our descent would have no time for scripts, costumes, or illusions. Tiberius didn't seek applause. He sought isolation, and what happened on the cliffs of Capri would disturb even the iron-stomached senators of Rome. And just like that, we've gone from Caligula's golden chaos to Nero's flaming stage play. 2 emperors, 1 empire, and absolutely no boundaries. If you're still here, you're clearly not afraid of the dark. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. This rabbit hole only gets deeper. Also, I'm curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Is it 2 a.m. in Toronto, noon in Nairobi? I want to know who else is up late unraveling the strange and sleepless history of royalty gone rogue. 3. Tiberius, Roman Emperor. If Caligula turned Rome into a stage and Nero turned it into a one-man opera, Tiberius quietly turned it into a locked room. He was the second emperor of Rome, stepping into the imperial sandals after the death of Augustus, his adoptive father and Rome's beloved founding figure. On paper, Tiberius had all the makings of a dutiful heir, an experienced general, politically cautious and personally reserved. But behind his severe face and stoic policies was a man who didn't want to rule. He wanted to disappear. And when he finally did, what emerged in his place was something far more unsettling. Tiberius ruled for more than 2 decades, from 14 CE to 37 CE. His early reign was marked by restraint, careful administration, and a sincere effort to continue Augustus's reforms. He was efficient, perhaps even too efficient, wary of flattery, uncomfortable with grandeur, and skeptical of anyone who seemed too eager to serve. This made him seem cold, remote, almost robotic. Rome was used to rulers who craved attention. Tiberius seemed to resent being noticed at all, but over time, something began to shift. As he aged, Tiberius grew increasingly withdrawn from the capital, uncomfortable with the spectacle of power and deeply suspicious of the Senate. Rome was, in his eyes, full of snakes, and he was right. The imperial court was a nest of whisperers, climbers, and covert schemers, many of whom had grown fat on Augustus's charm and generosity. Tiberius responded by retreating, not symbolically, but geographically. In 26 CE, the emperor left Rome and never returned. He relocated to the island of Capri, off the coast of Naples, where he built a sprawling villa complex high on cliffs above the sea. Officially, he was conducting imperial business in a more peaceful setting. In practice, he was creating a world within a world, one where he could control the flow of information, command absolute loyalty, and remain unseen. The Senate continued to meet. Laws were still passed. Rome continued to operate, but all roads now led to Capri, or more accurately, to the carefully guarded intermediaries who carried messages between the city and the emperor's high stone sanctuary. Tiberius ruled by proxy, issuing decrees through trusted aides like Lucius Aelius Sejanus, who became his unofficial right hand until he, too, grew too powerful and was destroyed. But while Tiberius's political retreat was noted with discomfort, it was the rumors about his private retreat that truly captivated and disturbed his contemporaries. Roman historians, most notably Suetonius and Tacitus, claimed that Capri became a palace of shadowy excess, a place where the emperor, now isolated from public accountability, began indulging behaviors that would have been unthinkable in Rome's civic center. Visitors and staff alike were vetted carefully. Servants who displeased the emperor were said to vanish without explanation. There were tales of elaborate rituals held within his villas, filled with performances and pleasures too strange or structured for even Rome's jaded elite. The chroniclers, who were no strangers to imperial scandal, described Capri in language usually reserved for nightmares. Secret tunnels, silent guards, attendants trained not just to serve, but to observe. There were persistent reports of young people, boys and girls, being brought to the island for entertainment, their presence explained as imperial necessity, their departure never witnessed. Were these stories true? Modern historians debate it. Some argue they were exaggerations, political hit pieces crafted by later writers who hated Tiberius's grim style of rule. But even if the tales were false, the fact that they flourished so easily reveals something essential about how Rome saw him, as a man who had slipped the leash of public morality and disappeared into his own imperial ide. And perhaps the most disturbing part, he liked it that way. While Nero paraded his desires through the streets and Caligula carved his into public ritual, Tiberius took his inward, into a sealed fortress where no applause was required and no opposition permitted. He didn't need spectacle, he had silence. He didn't crave power for admiration, he craved it for control. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, reportedly in a state of paranoia, surrounded by loyalists, estranged from almost every member of his own family, Rome had already begun to move on. His ashes were interred in the mausoleum of Augustus, but his legacy was that of a ghost emperor, present everywhere, seen nowhere, and remembered not for what he built, but for what he withdrew from. Yet in his absence, he left a kind of vacuum, a space for something louder, younger, and infinitely more theatrical to fill the void. And that space would be filled by his grandnephew, the same boy he once invited to Capri, who learned the rules of empire by watching him, and then decided to burn the rulebook altogether. Commodus was coming, and he brought the arena with him. 4. Commodus, Roman Emperor. By the time Commodus rose to the imperial throne in 180 CE, Rome had seen its fair share of emperors unravel, in palaces, in temples, on islands. But Commodus didn't unravel quietly. He unspooled in public, in costume, in blood-soaked arenas, and with a self-certainty so delusional it made even Caligula look restrained. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the Stoic emperor who spent his reign scribbling meditations and waging defensive wars against barbarian invasions. It was one of the great intellectual ironies of Roman history. The empire's most thoughtful emperor raised one of its most flamboyant disasters. Commodus wasn't interested in philosophy, or reform, or governance. He was interested in attention. And he would get it, whether by golden statue, gladiatorial triumph, or something far more debasing. He became co-emperor alongside his father at the age of 15 and sole emperor at 19. The early years of his reign showed some promise, mostly thanks to his inherited advisors, but almost immediately Commodus began withdrawing from state matters. It wasn't out of laziness, it was out of pure disinterest. Ruling an empire was boring. Fighting in the Colosseum, that was exciting. So he delegated governance to his favorites, many of them ex-slaves, gladiators, entertainers, or courtiers whose chief qualifications were loyalty and the ability to amuse him. Rome began to slide, politically, economically, and morally, while Commodus played games, and one of his favorite games was being a god. Not metaphorically. Commodus declared himself the living reincarnation of Hercules, had statues made of himself wearing lion skins, and forced senators to address him as a deity. He renamed months after his own titles. He renamed Rome after himself. He even had the motto of the empire changed to include his personal epithets. This wasn't ego. This was imperial cosplay, made compulsory, but nowhere did Commodus blur the line between ruler and performer more than in the gladiatorial arena. He didn't just attend games, he entered them. In front of thousands of Roman citizens, he took up his wooden sword, stepped into the arena, and performed choreographed battles against disabled opponents, wild animals that had been wounded beforehand, or gladiators too terrified to actually fight. Of course, he always won. The crowd always cheered, because not cheering could mean execution. These performances weren't limited to the amphitheater. His palace became a theater of humiliation, where courtiers were made to act out scenes for his amusement. He enjoyed elaborate sexual games, bizarre ceremonial dinners, and rituals so peculiar that even Rome's jaded elite began to squirm. Guests could be summoned at any hour. Roles were assigned. No one knew whether they would be asked to dance, fight, or grovel. The emperor was the only one with a script. Commodus's approach to women, both inside and outside the court, was marked by an obsessive need for domination and display. He kept a large retinue of companions, courtesans, and favorites whose function extended beyond pleasure into the realm of public symbolism. The emperor didn't just take lovers, he made statements with them. He flaunted relationships, elevated favorites to positions of court influence, then discarded them just as publicly. Their humiliation was part of the entertainment. And then there were the rumors. Some claimed that Commodus kept his concubines dressed as priestesses and ordered them to participate in mock religious ceremonies that served no god but himself. Others said he forced men and women of noble birth into servitude for his nightly banquets, where hierarchy meant nothing and shame was a game. But perhaps most disturbing was how all of it, the violence, the theatre, the degradation, was folded into the imperial identity. Commodus didn't see his behavior as deviant. He saw it as divine. His excesses weren't private missteps, they were public policies. He made the empire kneel not just to a man, but to a persona, one who demanded applause, obedience, and absolute surrender to the absurd. In the end, the empire had had enough. His inner circle, exhausted and endangered, conspired against him. On December 31st, 192 CE, Commodus was assassinated in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, hired by his own advisors. Rome tore down his statues, erased his name from monuments, condemned his memory, and yet he left something behind, a dangerous idea, that absolute power, when paired with absolute spectacle, can disguise itself as worship, even as it devours the state. But Commodus was not the only Roman emperor who believed himself chosen by heaven to blur all boundaries. The next on our list, Elagabalus, would take that belief even further. He wouldn't just pretend to be a god. He would replace Rome's gods with his own, and demand the entire empire join him in his devotion. 5. Elagabalus, Roman Emperor. By the time Elagabalus ascended the Roman throne in 218 CE, the empire had already seen its share of spectacle. It had hosted emperors who deified themselves, emperors who fought as gladiators, and emperors who governed by paranoia. But Elagabalus, he was a different beast entirely. Not a tyrant in disguise or a philosopher gone rogue, but a teenage high priest from Syria who brought an entire religion, a wardrobe of confusion, and a whiplash-inducing set of rituals into the very heart of Rome. His reign lasted only 4 years, but it burned through Roman decorum like a meteor through parchment. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, he was made emperor at just 14 by the military and political scheming of his grandmother Julia Maesa, a power broker of terrifying competence. Elagabalus had been serving as high priest of the eastern sun god Elagabal, or Elagabalus, from whom he took his imperial name, in the city of Emesa. His elevation to emperor wasn't just a change in role, it was a theological coup. From the moment he stepped foot in Rome, he ruled not as Caesar's successor, but as a divine representative of his god, and he made sure everyone knew it. One of his first acts as emperor, he imported the sacred black stone of his god, a meteorite believed to embody Elagabal himself, into the capital and installed it in a newly built temple, the Elagabalium, on the Palatine Hill. He declared his god superior to Jupiter, the chief Roman deity, and ordered the integration of all Roman religious practice under this new Eastern cult. Traditional rites were suspended, established priests were sidelined. Rome, a city that tolerated many gods but had never bowed to one foreign upstart, was stunned. But Elagabalus wasn't just transforming theology, he was rewriting the entire performance of imperial identity. He refused to conform to Roman expectations of masculinity, dress, or behavior. He wore makeup, styled his hair elaborately, and donned robes more typical of priestesses than emperors. He reportedly preferred to be addressed in feminine terms, and surrounded himself with an inner court that was as much a theatrical troupe as a governing body. For the Roman elite, already struggling with the erosion of old republican norms, this was not just uncomfortable, it was existentially threatening. The palace became a temple and theatre combined, where Elagabalus performed elaborate religious ceremonies that blended Syrian mysticism with Roman imperial spectacle. These weren't private rites, they were public events, and the emperor himself played the lead role in every performance. And at the heart of it all was an obsession with ritualized dominance, not just in religion or ceremony, but in every aspect of court life. Senators, generals, priests all found themselves at the mercy of a teenage ruler who assigned roles based not on rank or achievement, but on whim, aesthetics, or amusement. Elagabalus reportedly staged weddings, not once, but multiple times, to men, women, and others. The most infamous of these was his union with Heracles, a charioteer whom he allegedly referred to as his husband. Ancient writers, predictably scandalized, claimed that the emperor offered himself as a bride, orchestrated the ceremonies publicly, and demanded recognition from the Roman Senate for each new union. To Elagabalus, gender was not a fixed identity, but a costume, a role to be played, discarded, or reinvented. Roman chroniclers were apoplectic. Their accounts dripped with outrage, confusion, and no small amount of awe. They didn't know how to categorize him, so they labeled him mad, dangerous, perverse, anything to make sense of the spectacle. His palace was said to host ritualized banquets, where guests were unknowingly seated on airless cushions that hissed and collapsed mid-meal, or served food made entirely of wax, forcing nobles into games of absurdity in the presence of the emperor. At other times, they were reportedly showered with rose petals until they nearly suffocated, a literal metaphor for being smothered by luxury. These performances weren't just juvenile pranks. They were deliberate provocations, a way for Elagabalus to remind the aristocracy that their world no longer obeyed their rules. Power wasn't in the Senate chamber. It was on the stage, in the temple, in the person of the emperor-priest who refused to behave. But Rome, however tolerant of eccentricity, had limits. After 4 years of scandal, ritual, and near-theocratic rule, the tide turned. His own grandmother, the very architect of his rise, orchestrated his fall. In 222 CE, Elagabalus was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard, along with his mother. His body was desecrated, dragged through the streets, and dumped into the Tiber River, as if Rome were trying to exorcise not just a person, but a problem. Yet Elagabalus left a legacy that refused to vanish. He remains one of the most controversial figures in imperial history, a ruler whose personal expression, religious fervor, and total disregard for Roman tradition combined into a brief, brilliant, and chaotic explosion of identity and authority. He didn't break the rules, he ignored them. And if Elagabalus turned Rome into a ceremonial hallucination, the next figure in our procession dragged it into something colder, something bloodier. Because while Elagabalus played the high priest, Ivan the Terrible would play executioner, cloaking his empire in terror and dressing his court in fear. 6. Ivan the Terrible, Tsar of Russia. In the icy corridors of Russian history, Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, stands like a dark monument, not just to power, but to what happens when fear becomes an operating system. Crowned the first Tsar of all Russia in 1547, Ivan didn't just rule his empire. He dismantled and rebuilt it in his own image, piece by piece, until it no longer resembled a kingdom so much as a reflection of his inner world. Paranoid, merciless, and terrifyingly theatrical, and like all rulers who trafficked in terror, Ivan understood the power of spectacle, not just in war or law, but in his personal relationships, in the rituals of court, and especially in the private performances that took place behind the thick walls of his Kremlin apartments and isolated country estates. Ivan's reign was a long and contradictory one. He was a reformer in his youth, intelligent, highly literate, a patron of printing and religious scholarship. He introduced administrative reforms, established the Zemsky Sobor, a form of parliamentary council, and expanded Russia's borders with ruthless military efficiency. But underneath that early brilliance was something brittle, and as the years wore on, it cracked. The transformation of Ivan from promising Tsar to legendary tyrant was not a clean break. It was a slow erosion, driven by grief, betrayal, illness, and an obsession with control that seeped into every crevice of his life. His wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died under suspicious circumstances in 1560, and Ivan was never the same again. He believed she had been poisoned, possibly by the boyars, the noble aristocracy he already mistrusted. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. From that moment, paranoia became state doctrine. Enter the oprichnina, a system of state-sanctioned terror Ivan created to eliminate his enemies, both real and imagined. He divided Russia into two halves, the traditional state and the oprichnina, a shadow realm under his direct control. He staffed it with black-clad horsemen who answered only to him. They were not merely secret police, they were actors in a national horror story, and Ivan was both director and lead. The fear that gripped the Russian nobility during this time was not only political, it was deeply personal. Ivan's behavior at court became increasingly erratic. Nobles were summoned to his presence without warning. Some were flattered, others were humiliated. Many never returned. The walls of his palaces became arenas of uncertainty, where jesters, torturers, priests, and bureaucrats mingled uneasily under the same vaulted ceilings. And in the center of it all was Ivan, a ruler who treated his personal life not as private business, but as an extension of his rule. Ivan married at least 7 times, though not all of these unions were recognized by the church. Some lasted mere days. Others ended in swift annulments or quiet disappearances. The women chosen were often young, beautiful, and, crucially, politically powerless. There were persistent rumors, even among contemporary chroniclers, that many of these wives and consorts were handpicked from across the country, evaluated and delivered to the palace under the guise of beauty contests or inspections. The line between matchmaking and surveillance blurred quickly. Inside the palace, Ivan's relationships reportedly followed a strange choreography. He demanded loyalty, purity, and silence, not just from his wives, but from the court women more broadly. He could be generous one moment, cruel the next. There are stories of women elevated to near-royal status in the morning, only to be accused of betrayal by evening. Some were said to be banished, others quietly removed from court altogether. Whispers of secret chambers, hidden apartments, and servants instructed never to speak began to circulate, whispered, as always, behind sleeves. Ivan's paranoia extended to his own family. The most infamous episode, the one burned into Russian memory, was the death of his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. The exact details remain unclear, but most versions of the story agree that after a violent altercation, Ivan struck his son with such force that he later died. The painting by Ilya Repin, Ivan the Terrible and His Son, captures this moment with haunting intensity. The Tsar wide-eyed, cradling the dying boy, horrified by what he's done. Whether motivated by grief, guilt, or simply his need to dominate every situation, Ivan's rule grew darker still after this. The court became quieter, colder, trust became a liability. Servants and nobles learned not to speak unless spoken to, and sometimes not even then. By the time Ivan died in 1584, he had created something unlike anything Europe had seen. A monarchy that operated like a nightmare, where personal moods became policy and the boundary between private whims and public law no longer existed. But Ivan's terror wasn't just raw brutality. It was ritualized. It was scripted, like a stage play whose actors never got to see the script in advance. And if Ivan showed us the cold logic of fear as governance, the next monarch would offer a very different portrait. Not of terror in furs, but of curiosity in epaulets. Because Peter the Great, Ivan's distant successor, didn't retreat into paranoia, he dragged everyone else into his chaos, whether they liked it or not. 7. Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia. If Ivan the Terrible ruled by fear and shadow, Peter the Great ruled by force of will and spectacle. Not the dark, suffocating kind that crept through court corridors under candlelight, but the loud, chaotic, ale-drenched kind that smashed through doors, flipped over tables, and demanded a parade. Peter didn't just want to modernize Russia. He wanted to rip it out of the Middle Ages, stitch it into a new Western identity, and make it wear a powdered wig while he laughed from the sidelines. He wasn't just an emperor. He was a builder, a drinker, a sadist, a scientist, a czar, and at times an unapologetic human experimenter, not on science, but on his own people. Born in 1672 and ascending to sole rule in 1696, Peter stood at over 6.5 feet tall, towering, imposing, restless. His ambitions were even larger. He wanted Russia to be a European power. That meant a navy, modern cities, new laws, secular schools, and a total overhaul of everything from the calendar to facial hair. He personally cut the beards off nobles to enforce his new clean-shaven rule. He taxed anyone who dared grow them back. But beneath the reforms and revolutions was a man whose personal life was just as radical and frequently more chaotic than anything he enacted by decree. The same Tsar who launched the first Russian newspaper and engineered canals also had a penchant for mock weddings, improvised rituals, and staged debaucheries that left even hardened courtiers unsure whether they were participating in statecraft or being hazed by an immortal frat boy. Peter was obsessed with control, not just of systems, but of people, especially his court. He would create situations so absurd, so humiliating, that no one could navigate them with dignity intact. And that was the point. He wanted to break aristocratic pride, to flatten the rigid hierarchies of Muscovite nobility and replace them with something new, loyalty to him, not to tradition. One of his favorite tools? The all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, a fake religious order Peter invented, complete with ranks, rituals, vestments, and members drawn from the court's most powerful families. Their duties? Engage in elaborate parody, mock religious ceremonies, and host grotesquely over-the-top feasts where the line between jest and punishment was razor-thin. The synod wasn't just theatre. It was an exercise in submission. Nobles were forced to dress as clowns, bishops, and brides. They were married off in pretend ceremonies, made to toast to absurd causes, crawl on all fours, and dance until collapse, all while the Tsar watched, grinning, often half-naked himself. To refuse was dangerous. To laugh too little, suspicious. To laugh too much, risky. These weren't private jokes among friends. They were institutionalized humiliation rituals designed to test and bind Peter's inner circle to his will. He turned dignity into currency and then inflated it until it was worthless. And then there were his mock weddings, the most infamous of which involved his jester, an elderly dwarf, married off in full ceremony to a similarly diminutive woman in a pageant of grotesque splendor. Peter invited hundreds of guests, hosted the event in St. Petersburg, and spared no expense. The bride and groom were paraded in a cage, feasts were held, and attendees were expected to cheer and toast with conviction. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a message. In his Russia, the Tsar defined the boundaries of propriety. Peter's own romantic life was no less turbulent. His first marriage to Eudoxia Lopukina was arranged for political stability. He grew to despise her, or perhaps more accurately what she represented, the old Russia. He exiled her to a convent and later publicly humiliated her in court, forcing her to watch as he paraded his second wife, Marta Skavronskaya, a Lithuanian maid turned empress, before the aristocracy. Marta, renamed Catherine I, was Peter's true partner, a sharp, practical woman who indulged his chaos, calmed his rages, and played along with his rituals. Their relationship was unconventional, stormy, and deeply theatrical. It was said Peter once ordered a man executed for flirting with her, only to pardon him a moment later with a toast. No one ever knew where the performance ended and the judgment began. And that was the core of Peter's private life. Unpredictability as power. Ritualized mockery as loyalty test. Pleasure used not for escape, but for domination. By the time Peter died in 1725, he had transformed Russia. He'd founded a new capital, St. Petersburg, opened the empire to the west, built a navy from scratch, and in the process left a legacy of modernity stained with madness. But even his most excessive displays of control were grounded in a kind of logic. The next ruler in our journey, Louis XV of France, would take the same obsession with pleasure and bury it in velvet, whisper and denial. Peter forced his court into chaos. Louis built a palace of silence and filled it with secrets. 8. Louis XV of France. There are palaces built for kings, and then there are palaces built for secrets. Louis XV had both. One was the gilded monstrosity of Versailles, all mirrors, chandeliers, and tightly choreographed etiquette. The other was Parc aux Cerfs, quiet, hidden, and carefully erased from official maps. Where Versailles served as the theatre of power, Parc aux Cerfs was the dressing room, intimate, unspoken, and steeped in the peculiar moral fog of 18th century France. Louis XV began his reign as the darling of Europe, young, elegant, and dubbed the well-beloved. He was supposed to be the breath of fresh air after the long, absolutist reign of Louis XIV, but time has a strange sense of irony. The man who inherited a kingdom obsessed with order and legacy slowly unraveled into a king obsessed with secrecy and indulgence. His early years were promising enough. He was married off to the devout Polish princess Marie Leszczyńska, who did what royal brides were expected to do: produce heirs and smile through her husband's distractions. And there were many distractions. At first, the mistresses were semi-official. Names like Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry, women of wit and influence who wielded real political sway from behind silk curtains. But eventually, even the formal mistress system, la maîtresse en titre, became too cumbersome, too political, too visible. Louis wanted something quieter, something more private, something that could be controlled. So the king and his advisors created Parc aux Cerfs, the Deer Park. Despite the bucolic name, this was no rural hunting lodge. It was a townhouse near the palace, discreetly managed and funded through secret accounts. Its purpose? To house young women, most often teenage girls, selected, groomed, and delivered for the king's personal pleasure. They were kept out of sight, rotated quietly, and rarely spoken of in polite company. For many years, even their identities were scrubbed from official records. The operation was managed with bureaucratic precision. Agents would identify girls from modest families, often under the pretense of offering education or employment, and negotiate with parents or guardians. The chosen were placed in the house, given new clothes, and made to wait. Some stayed weeks, others longer. Few had any say in the matter. It wasn't technically slavery, but it also wasn't freedom. It lived in that grey zone where power doesn't need chains to bind, just silence. Louis was aging by then, and his political influence was waning. His court became divided between the traditionalists and the libertines, between those who prayed and those who partied. But Parc aux Cerfs persisted. Even as the country edged toward revolution, even as the coffers emptied and the people grew restless, the house remained. A symbol not of personal vice, but of systemic rot, a private pleasure made possible only by an empire's public obedience. What makes this chapter so strange isn't just the moral ugliness, though that's undeniable, but how carefully the system was preserved. The king's pleasure was a matter of state. The silence surrounding it, a form of policy. Versailles was the face, Parc aux Cerfs was the mask, and still Louis imagined himself beloved. Even as respect turned to scandal and scandal to anger, he never quite grasped that France had stopped looking at him like a father and started watching him like a man asleep in a burning house. But not all monarchs needed shadow palaces to indulge their obsessions. Some were shameless enough to turn the court itself into a playground. Velvet drapes, painted faces, and scandal by appointment. The next king on our list earned his nickname not for his policies, but for the way he partied. He was Charles II of England, the merry monarch with a calendar full of mistresses and a kingdom still reeling from plague, fire, and the aftermath of regicide. 9. Charles II of England. Some kings wore crowns like chains. Charles II wore his like a party hat. After a childhood spent dodging executioners, a father beheaded by Parliament, and a decade of exile as England dabbled in Puritanism and military dictatorship, Charles returned in 1660 with a singular mission: restore the monarchy, and have a very, very good time doing it. The Restoration, as history calls it, was more than political. It was theatrical. Cromwell's moral austerity had turned England into a place where dancing was frowned upon and Christmas was cancelled. Charles brought the revelry back, along with theatres, courtiers, and a court so lubricated by drink, poetry, and scandal that it felt more like a never-ending masked ball than a government. He was nicknamed the Merry Monarch, and he earned it with dedication. Charles didn't just tolerate hedonism, he sponsored it. His court became a stage for flirtation, indulgence, and artful misbehaviour. Where other monarchs hid their mistresses in the wings, Charles gave them star billing. Barbara Palmer, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Keroualle, each became a celebrity in her own right, their affairs with the king common knowledge, their portraits hanging in halls of state as casually as military commanders. But Charles's charm wasn't just sexual, it was political. He understood that after years of repression and war, the public craved delight. His easy wit, unpretentious manners, and public strolls made him seem approachable, even lovable, and in return, England looked the other way as the palace filled with whispered intrigues and velvet-coated excess. Yet beneath the laughter, there was calculation. Charles used pleasure the way others used policy, as a tool of control. By keeping his court preoccupied with romantic rivalries, poetry duels, and theatrical squabbles, he distracted ambitious nobles from plotting. By promoting actresses to royal favourites, he blurred the line between social class and proximity to power, keeping the old aristocracy guessing and the new one grateful. He had no legitimate heirs, but fathered at least a dozen children through his many mistresses. Instead of hiding them, he legitimized several, granting titles and estates as casually as party favors. It was monarchy by charisma, lineage by improvisation. Yet not all found the laughter comforting. Religious conservatives, still licking their wounds from the Civil War, saw Charles's court as a moral catastrophe. Foreign diplomats wrote home in amused horror, and the public, charmed as they were, sometimes winced, especially when money ran short, taxes rose, and the king seemed more focused on masks than ministers. Parliament grew restless. The spectre of absolutism loomed, and Charles, ever the escapist, danced around confrontation with the skill of a seasoned actor. He knew how to pause, how to flatter, how to promise just enough reform to delay rebellion. His genius wasn't in legislation, it was in mood management. He died without naming an heir, slipping away into legend as the last English king to rule by sheer magnetism. And when the crown passed to his dour brother James II, England realised how fragile that charm had been. The party was over, but Charles had left a template. Monarchy as performance, scandal as strategy, intimacy as theatre. It was a model that wouldn't die, only mutate, because the next king on our list had fewer jokes and far more swords. His love life wasn't romantic or comedic, it was transactional, coercive, and rumoured to run darker than history was willing to write down. Henry VIII wasn't merry, he was magnificent, terrifying, and unforgettable. And when he wanted something, whether it was a woman, a son, or the church itself, he didn't flirt, he dismantled. 10. Henry VIII of England. If Charles II ruled with charm, Henry VIII ruled with certainty, the kind that doesn't blink, doesn't ask, and certainly doesn't apologize. He was not born into crisis like Charles, nor shaped by exile like his predecessors. Henry was born into a throne still warm from war and soaked in legitimacy. He didn't inherit doubt, he inherited destiny, and he made sure everyone else felt it. To the outside world, Henry VIII began as the Renaissance ideal, tall, handsome, athletic, gifted in music and languages, deeply educated, and determined to project the glory of a modern monarch. His court was a mirror of continental sophistication, filled with tapestries, tournaments, and theological debates. But underneath the gold embroidery and polished verses was a man for whom kingship was less about stewardship and more about possession. Possession of land, of loyalty, of God's approval, and yes, of women. Henry's love life is often reduced to a roll call of wives, 6 in total, each remembered by the schoolhouse rhyme: Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But the real story isn't just about marriage. It's about a king who used marriage as a lever to move heaven and earth, and who viewed the bodies of others as tools of dynasty, destiny, or occasionally disposal. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, was a political match, a Spanish princess, his brother's widow, and a partner of real dignity and strength. For years they were harmonious, but she gave him only one surviving child, a daughter, and in Henry's mind, daughters were not destiny, they were delay. Enter Anne Boleyn, sharp, witty, and dangerously unafraid. What began as courtly flirtation became a national crisis. Henry petitioned the Pope for a divorce. When Rome hesitated, Henry cut the entire nation off from the Catholic Church. He invented the Church of England, not from theology, but from frustration. The personal became political, and the political became permanent. Anne gave him another daughter, Elizabeth, then a string of miscarriages. Henry grew restless. The court whispered, the law shifted, and suddenly Anne, once elevated as queen and muse, was branded a traitor, tried and executed. The pattern repeated. Jane Seymour gave him the son he wanted, Edward, but died shortly after childbirth. Then came Anne of Cleves, dismissed after one look. Then Catherine Howard, young and adored until she wasn't. Then Catherine Parr, more nurse than bride, who managed to survive him. But what's often missed in the recounting of Henry's romantic brutality is how much of it was wrapped in ceremony. These weren't back-alley decisions. They were trials, proclamations, parliamentary sessions, papal fights, and choreographed kinged collapses. Henry's personal desires were staged as moral imperatives, national necessities, or divine mandates. He didn't simply end marriages, he reshaped law, doctrine, and identity around them. His court was a place of constant vigilance, especially for women. Ladies-in-waiting were not just attendants, they were watched, used, accused, and discarded, depending on the king's mood and need. A flirtatious glance could become a charge, a rumour could end in a tower, and behind every wedding veil was a shadow of fear. Henry VIII died bloated, paranoid, and surrounded by a court more weary than loyal. His son Edward would reign only briefly. His daughter Mary would reign in flames, and his second daughter, Elizabeth, Anne's child, would rule for decades, haunted and shaped by her father's legacy. But Henry's way of blending power, desire, and policy into one unstoppable force left a mark not just on England, but on monarchy itself. And while his appetites were veiled in ritual, the next king in our story made no such effort. He was a monarch who couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, himself even as his own body began to shake from the inside. Christian VII of Denmark turned the palace into a pressure cooker of scandal, paranoia, and unchecked indulgence. And unlike Henry, he wasn't in control of it. 11. Christian VII of Denmark. Some monarchs were born into chaos. Christian VII of Denmark was born into a palace, but carried chaos within him. His reign from 1766 to 1808 is one of the strangest in European royal history, not because of wars or revolutions, but because of the private turbulence that spilled slowly and embarrassingly into public view. If Henry VIII was terrifying in his certainty, Christian VII was unsettling in his unpredictability. He ascended the throne at just 17 years old. On paper, Denmark-Norway was a stable dual monarchy with a solid bureaucracy. In reality, it was ruled by courtiers, advisors, and a young king whose erratic behavior made him more a symbol than a sovereign. Early observers described him as bright and sensitive, but volatile. In an age that did not have words like mental illness or trauma, his symptoms were instead framed as eccentricities, moral failings, or shocking habits. Christian's private life quickly became a theatre of self-destruction. He surrounded himself with young companions, indulged in excessive gambling, and cultivated a reputation for scandalous pranks. His erratic energy often erupted into gestures meant to shock. He would insult dignitaries, mimic his ministers, or vanish from formal events to pursue private amusements. But perhaps the most infamous stories about him centered on his compulsions, behaviors whispered about by courtiers and recorded in memoirs with a mixture of pity and disgust. He was said to have an obsessive fixation with his own body, spending hours in private acts of self-indulgence and speaking about them openly, even at formal gatherings. In a court built on ritualized dignity, this was not just improper, it was destabilizing. Servants, ministers, and even foreign ambassadors began reporting that the king's habits were making government impossible. His marriage to Caroline Matilda, the 15-year-old sister of King George III of England, did nothing to stabilize him. The union was political and cold from the start. Christian's neglect and humiliations drove Caroline into the arms of Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's German physician, a man who would become both her lover and the de facto ruler of Denmark. Struensee implemented sweeping reforms, abolishing torture, improving education, loosening censorship, all while essentially running the country on behalf of a king increasingly sidelined by his own instability. For a brief, dazzling period, Denmark looked almost progressive under Struensee's guidance, but the arrangement was too precarious to last. In 1772, a palace coup removed Struensee and arrested Caroline Matilda, sending her into exile. Christian remained on the throne in name, but he was more a captive of his advisors than a ruler. His later years were spent in seclusion, shadowed by paranoia, compulsions, and a court that regarded him less as a monarch than a tragic curiosity. Christian 7. Story reads like a pre-modern case study in how absolute power can magnify personal fragility. His bizarre practices were not those of a calculating tyrant or an ambitious showman, but of a young man drowning inside his own palace, turning self-indulgence and disruption into his only form of agency. But if Christian's court was a slow-motion implosion, the next ruler on our list would take his debauchery into the shadows of a secret society, a carefully choreographed world of rituals, symbols, and velvet-lined power games that blurred the line between enlightenment and indulgence. That man was Frederick William II of Prussia, whose private Order of the Mopsies would scandalize even the stiffest military state in Europe. 12. Frederick William II of Prussia. If his uncle Frederick the Great ruled with iron discipline and Enlightenment prose, then Frederick William II ruled with scented letters, secret rituals, and a velvet glove permanently wrapped around a wine glass. He inherited the Prussian throne in 1786, a nation forged in military drills and Protestant rigor, and promptly turned it into something softer, stranger, and far more indulgent. Frederick William II was not a king who delighted in uniforms. He delighted in music, mysticism, and women, many women. Though officially married, he openly kept a string of mistresses, not in back rooms or quiet country houses, but right alongside the machinery of state. His liaisons were more than personal preferences. They were fixtures of his court, woven into the fabric of his daily life, sometimes even granted titles and influence over ministers. But the most peculiar and persistently whispered chapter of his reign was tied to a secretive, half-parodic, half-religious society known as the Order of the Mopsies. At first glance, the Mopsies, or Mopsorden, as they were known in German, resembled the secret societies popular in Enlightenment Europe. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, esoteric clubs for men who believed they could study morality between toasts of wine and staged rituals. But the Mopsies were something different, stranger, wilder, more deliberately bizarre. The name itself, Mops, referred to the pug dog, which served as the society's mascot and symbol. Why a pug? Accounts vary, but the animal was said to represent loyalty, devotion, and, in some interpretations, a certain ironic obedience. Members wore pug masks during initiation rites. They crawled on all fours. They barked. They kissed the behind of a porcelain pug statue as a sign of loyalty. And all of this was meant not just as satire, but as sacred parody, a mocking inversion of religious ritual designed to bind the members together in secrecy and laughter. Frederick William II was more than a casual participant. He was said to be a patron and protector of the Mopsies. The society blended his personal tastes, mysticism, sensuality, ceremony, into a private world where power could be playful and devotion could be, well, performed. Initiations involved blindfolds, erotic symbolism, and whispered oaths. Meetings were held in candlelit chambers, and beneath the humor was a serious undercurrent. This was a space where the king could escape the rigidity of public life, indulge his intellectual curiosities, and explore pleasures that polite society would never accept in daylight. But it wasn't all masked dances and secret handshakes. The Mopsies also dabbled in politics, using their privacy to protect allies and arrange favors. Mistresses became members. Courtiers followed suit. The boundaries between spiritual game, social club, and unofficial government began to blur, and for many outside the circle, that was deeply unsettling. Frederick William's reign, though less militaristic than his uncle's, was marked by erratic governance. He alternated between progressive reforms and reactionary crackdowns. His foreign policy wobbled, his finances sagged, but behind the missteps was a ruler who never quite saw himself as a traditional king. He was the conductor of an elaborate opera, half philosophy, half farce. And while his personal life may seem comical now, it carried a deeper irony that the most powerful man in one of Europe's most disciplined states found peace not in drills or war councils, but in candlelit rooms filled with masks, music, and a statue of a pug. But even Frederick William's whimsical rituals would pale in comparison to the rumors that surrounded the next monarch. A woman whose reign was brilliant, whose policies were sharp, and whose personal appetites sparked legends that refused to die. That woman was Catherine the Great, and the empire she ruled would never again be confused for modest. 13. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia. Few monarchs have suffered from a more toxic blend of myth, envy, and innuendo than Catherine II of Russia, better known as Catherine the Great. She was a woman who ruled an empire larger than any in Europe, reformed its institutions, expanded its borders, and conversed with philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, all while fending off a legend that reduced her to nothing more than a punchline of palace gossip. To be a woman with power in the 18th century was to invite scrutiny. To be a woman who kept power was to invite slander. Catherine, a German-born princess who took the Russian throne after her husband was mysteriously removed from power, read a coup in which she was not uninvolved, understood this from the beginning. And yet, she didn't just survive in the Russian court, she remade it in her image. But behind the reforms, the schools, the hospitals, the Enlightenment flair, there were whispers. Persistent, unrelenting whispers. Unlike many rulers of her time, Catherine did not feign celibacy or hide her private life behind a curtain of denial. She had lovers, several, and she didn't rotate them secretly. She installed them. Each was given a title, a salary, sometimes an estate. When they fell out of favor, they were dismissed politely, even generously. If anything, Catherine handled romance with the same bureaucratic efficiency she brought to government. And yet, the very transparency of her preferences only fueled the rumors. Her enemies, both at home and abroad, couldn't resist turning her lovers into evidence of moral collapse. Satirical pamphlets flooded Europe, mocking her not as a stateswoman but as an insatiable figure of ridicule. And as with all rumors, the line between truth and invention grew thin and irrelevant. One enduring tale described a secret system Catherine used to test potential lovers before they were officially introduced to her. a vetting process supposedly managed by loyal servants. The story goes that men were observed for appearance, intelligence, discretion, and other traits. While no proof of this ever surfaced, the myth persisted, like all good court gossip, because it sounded just plausible enough, and in a world that couldn't imagine a woman having both power and pleasure, it provided an easy narrative. She must have ruled with her heart, or worse. Yet Catherine herself rarely addressed the rumours. She ruled. She corresponded with Europe's greatest minds. She expanded into Crimea. She rewrote the Russian legal code. Her reforms were complex, often contradictory, occasionally hypocritical, much like the Enlightenment itself. But through it all, she retained her dignity, her ambition, and her signature blend of cold calculation and warm charm. What makes Catherine's story so compelling isn't the scandal. It's how she outlived it, how she built a legacy so vast that even the most persistent slanders seem small in its shadow. She was not the first empress to be feared or the first ruler to be loved, but she may have been the first to fully weaponize both. And yet, for all her empire-sized achievements, the rumors never stopped. Because when a woman rules like a man, the world rarely forgives her. It mocks her instead. But while Catherine elevated scandal into statecraft, the next monarch in our list would indulge in a different kind of excess, less enlightened, more exhausted. A king whose palace amusements had no pretense of philosophy, just velvet, incense, and the steady disapproval of every priest within earshot. That king was Philip IV of Spain, and his pleasures weren't whispered, they were confessed. 14. Philip IV of Spain. When Philip IV of Spain took the throne in 1621, he inherited not just the crown of the world's most powerful empire, but the crumbling illusion that such an empire could be managed without moral decay. Spain at the time stretched from the gold mines of the Americas to the silver veins of the Philippines, a global behemoth run from palaces filled with incense, anxiety, and velvet-covered sins. And no king embodied that contradiction more than Philip IV. Officially, he was His Catholic Majesty, defender of the faith, guardian of the Spanish Habsburg legacy, and patron of the Counter-Reformation. Unofficially, he was something closer to a full-time enthusiast of pleasure wrapped in the garments of divine authority. His reign was marked by a curious duality: austerity in public, indulgence in private, devotion to ritual on the surface, chaos behind the curtains. Philip wasn't a frivolous fool. He was educated, artistically inclined, and genuinely obsessed with the theatre, both literal and political. He patronized Diego Velázquez, turned court life into a daily performance, and filled his hours with everything but governance. In his youth, he was described as pious and promising. By middle age, he was overworked, overstimulated, and surrounded by courtiers who were paid more for flattery than for honesty. But the centerpiece of Philip's private court wasn't just art or literature, it was amusement, a term that in 17th century Spain covered a multitude of sins. He reportedly had dozens of mistresses, often drawn from the theatre world, where beauty, performance, and discretion were all part of the job description. These women weren't just companions, they were symbols of status, trophies of virility, and on occasion, minor political figures in their own right. The king's appetite for romantic diversion was legendary, even by royal standards. His relationships were not hidden so much as managed, accommodated by the palace, tolerated by the church, and chronicled by a deeply uncomfortable aristocracy. Courtiers were expected to play along, priests to look away, and ministers to clean up the consequences. It's estimated that Philip fathered over 30 children, many of them illegitimate, scattered across a network of courtesans, noblewomen, and actresses. The contradiction was sharp. A ruler devoted to Catholic purity who used confession more like a rinse cycle than a reckoning. Priests reportedly complained of the frequency and monotony of his moral failings. Always the same sins, always the same remorse, always followed by the same quiet return to indulgence. And still he took governance seriously, or at least wanted to be seen as doing so. He wrote political treatises, met with advisers daily, and wept when Spain lost territories in Europe. But his court had become bloated with distractions, his judgment clouded by exhaustion, and his power increasingly symbolic. By the end of his reign, the Spanish Empire was visibly fraying. Wars dragged on, debts mounted, and the myth of Spanish invincibility faded. And yet Philip remained in place, surrounded by gold-threaded tapestries and scandalous silence. He died as he lived, pious, surrounded by clergy, whispering prayers and cloaked in rituals. But even as the bells of Madrid tolled for his soul, those who had known his court remembered not just the grandeur, but the decadence, the way moral gravity was bent to suit royal appetite, and how confession became less a sacrament and more a cycle. But where Philip turned sin into ceremony, the next king on our list turned pleasure into bankruptcy. His court was less devout, more decorative, filled with corsets, creditors, and candlelit catastrophes. That king was George IV of England, a monarch whose reputation managed to combine financial ruin, romantic disaster, and sartorial brilliance, all while falling out of his saddle. 15. George IV of England. If monarchs were judged by how much lace they could wear before noon, George IV of England would rank among the greatest. But beneath the embroidery and the excess, there was something else, a deeply insecure man who spent his reign staging a performance of elegance, while backstage everything slowly unraveled. He was born in 1762, the eldest son of King George III, and by the time he took the throne in 1820, he had already spent decades preparing, not in statesmanship, but in self-indulgence. As Prince of Wales, George lived like a man permanently auditioning for a role he secretly hoped would be cancelled. He drank, danced, gambled, decorated, and seduced his way through the English aristocracy, racking up debts so astronomical that Parliament had to intervene, repeatedly. But George didn't just spend money, he weaponized luxury. His residences, including the absurdly opulent Royal Pavilion in Brighton, were exercises in escapism, designed with the subtlety of a sugar crash. Orientalist fantasies, golden dragons, mirrored walls, indoor palm trees, all carefully arranged to distract the eye from the growing reality that the empire was evolving and the monarchy was stagnating. His love life was less opera and more farce. He secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, in violation of the Royal Marriages Act, a union legally invalid but emotionally significant. Later, forced into a dynastic marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick, George recoiled. He loathed her almost immediately. Their wedding was awkward, their wedding night was worse, and their separation became the stuff of satirical legend. Caroline, for her part, refused to disappear quietly. When George ascended to the throne, she returned to England to claim her place as queen. He retaliated by putting her on trial for adultery in what became a national scandal, a public relations disaster that pitted a wildly unpopular king against a woman the people found themselves cheering for, if only out of spite. In the background of these soap operas, George maintained a carousel of mistresses, courtesans, and actresses, many of whom became fixtures in his orbit. He adored spectacle, not just attending theatre, but living as if he were the lead actor in a costume drama. His waistline expanded with his appetites, and he took to wearing corsets, heavy makeup, and elaborately styled wigs, in an era increasingly leaning toward modernity. It's easy to laugh at George IV, and people did, constantly. Caricaturists made a fortune from his bloated image. He was lampooned in the press, mocked in Parliament, and booed in public. But behind the vanity was a man shaped by contradiction, desperate for admiration, terrified of aging, obsessed with control, and utterly unsuited for the role of national father figure. Yet paradoxically, George's reign marked cultural flourishing. He championed the arts, oversaw architectural achievements like Regent Street and Buckingham Palace's renovation, and helped define the Regency aesthetic. He was a terrible king in the traditional sense, but an accidental patron of a glittering age. The king who mistook his personal whims for public good and, in doing so, inadvertently shaped a national style. By the time of his death in 1830, few mourned. He was remembered not for leadership, but for lifestyle, not for diplomacy, but for debt, not for dignity, but for decoration. But if George IV turned romance into bankruptcy and monarchy into masquerade, the next royal in our tale would descend into something darker, an heir who turned fantasy into obsession, and obsession into tragedy. Because where George performed his scandals under chandeliers, Prince Rudolph of Austria would play out his final act behind locked doors. 16. Prince Rudolph of Austria. In the rigid clockwork of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Prince Rudolph, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, was a misfit gear, too restless, too romantic, too modern for the machine he was meant to inherit. Born into one of Europe's most protocol-bound dynasties, Rudolph was raised to embody the old imperial ideal. Instead, he became its most tragic critic. He was brilliant, moody, and deeply intellectual, a man drawn to liberal ideas in a deeply conservative empire. While his father upheld order and tradition with an iron sense of duty, Rudolph immersed himself in science, philosophy, and forbidden books. He wrote essays under pseudonyms, corresponded with radical thinkers, and confessed privately to feeling caged by his birthright. But the empire wasn't interested in what the prince thought. It wanted him to behave, marry appropriately, and produce heirs. So, of course, it gave him a marriage that was cold, political, and barren of affection. Rudolph's union with Princess Stephanie of Belgium was arranged and, by most accounts, strained from the beginning. He found her dull, she found him erratic. What followed was a spiral of distraction, detachment, and self-destruction. Rudolph, like many royals before him, turned to extramarital affairs. But unlike his predecessors, he did not wear his indulgences like medals. He wore them like wounds. Vienna's court was already a theatre of whispers. Rudolph made it worse. He drank heavily, surrounded himself with artists and journalists, and entertained darker obsessions with mortality, decline, and the burdens of inheritance. His relationships grew more intense, more escapist, more desperate. One such relationship was with Baroness Mary Vetsera, a teenage aristocrat drawn into Rudolph's melancholy orbit. Their bond was not merely romantic, it was theatrical, enveloped in coded letters, secret meetings, and the kind of doomed idealism that turns romance into mythology. What exactly happened at the Meiling hunting lodge in 1889, where both Rudolph and Mary were found dead, remains a topic of intense speculation. The official narrative was swiftly controlled by the court. Rudolph had suffered a mental breakdown. Mary had died tragically. It was declared a private matter, best left undisturbed. But the truth was murkier. Letters were destroyed, witnesses were silenced, and what remained was an open wound in the Habsburg dynasty, one covered by flowers, gossip, and layers of official forgetting. What makes Rudolph's story linger is not the tragedy itself, but the sense that it was a slow-motion collapse, a royal who saw the future but couldn't survive the present, a man caught between the weight of his name and the hunger to live beyond it. The empire would march on, rigid and unyielding, right into the catastrophe of the First World War. But Rudolph's death left a psychic fracture in Austria, proof that even heirs can become prisoners, and that not all rebellions wear uniforms. And yet, the royal stage rolled forward. The next monarch in our journey wouldn't retreat into philosophy or tragedy. He would embrace pleasure unapologetically, outfitting his Parisian adventures with custom-made furniture and a smile that scandalized even the French. That man was Edward VII of England, and his throne began in the bedroom long before it reached Buckingham Palace. 17. Edward VII of England. Before he became king, Edward VII was already the most scandalous man in Europe, and perhaps the most photographed. The eldest son of Queen Victoria, he spent nearly 6 decades waiting for the throne, which meant he had time, and Edward never let time go to waste. He filled it with parties, mistresses, Parisian excursions, and a kind of strategic laziness that somehow made him more popular, not less. To his mother, he was a chronic disappointment, morally unreliable, politically unserious, and obsessed with pleasure. She once wrote that she couldn't look at him without feeling grief, but to the public, he became something else entirely, a symbol of opulent distraction in a rigid age. The young Prince of Wales took to France with the enthusiasm of a man born to overstay his welcome. He was a fixture at the Moulin Rouge, the Folies Bergères, and an entire constellation of elite brothels, known not just for discretion, but for creativity. One Parisian establishment, Le Chabanais, is where his most infamous indulgence emerged. A custom-built love chair designed specifically to accommodate the prince's preferences and girth. Crafted with brass fittings and padded leather, the chair was equal parts absurd and functional, and it was whispered about with the kind of scandalized fascination that only a royal sex chair can inspire. But Edward's escapades weren't just tabloid fodder, they were diplomatic events. His presence in France softened Anglo-French relations. His flirtations with actresses and dancers were observed by ambassadors. His nights out were court gossip in Berlin and political discussion in Vienna. He turned personal pleasure into a form of soft power, or at least soft distraction. At home, his reputation was no less notorious. He held private dinners with an exclusive circle of aristocrats and actresses, where lines between guest and entertainment were blurry. The Prince of Wales's circle was glittering, immoral, and deeply influential, and for decades all of this unfolded without him having to carry the burdens of actual kingship. When he finally became king in 1901, after Queen Victoria's death, many feared a reign of debauchery. Instead, they got a surprising figure. Still indulgent, yes, but also diplomatic, quick-witted and oddly stabilizing. He smoothed tensions across Europe, hosted statesmen with flair, and restored charm to a monarchy that had grown stiff with mourning. But the past didn't disappear. He remained the king whose waistline was the subject of political cartoons, whose private furniture was legendary, and whose mistresses included half the guest list at society galas. Edward VII didn't hide his appetites. He wore them like medals, silk-lined, wine-splashed, scandal-proof. Still, he understood something few monarchs did, that to survive public scandal, one had to be likable, and Edward was, infuriatingly so. But if Edward's exploits were wrapped in charm and cigar smoke, the next king on our list possessed none of that warmth. He was cultured, calculating, and allegedly ran his court like a finishing school, with private lessons that no tutor should ever approve. He was Francis III of France, and behind his dazzling reputation as the father of the Renaissance lay an obsession with beauty that went far beyond art. 18. Francis III of France. In the gilded history of the French Renaissance, Francis I cuts a striking figure. A tall, charismatic king who brought Italy's artistic genius to France, commissioned architectural masterpieces, and turned his court into a glittering centre of elegance and erudition. He was a patron of Leonardo da Vinci, a reformer of education, and a collector of manuscripts, paintings, and prestige. But Francis didn't just collect culture, he collected people, and he curated them with the same discernment he applied to art. Nicknamed the Father of Letters, Francis was also known, less officially, as a connoisseur of physical beauty. His court was a theatre of charm and seduction, where appearances were everything and roles shifted depending on who caught the king's eye. His fascination with youth, refinement, and performance extended far beyond courtly romance. It became a system. Contemporary accounts, usually wrapped in euphemism and courtly language, describe a bizarre setup inside the royal palaces. Young pages, chosen for their beauty, were said to be trained in both etiquette and in a more peculiar form of attentiveness. These boys, dressed impeccably and instructed in all forms of polite behavior, were reportedly given roles that went well beyond the ceremonial. And then there were the women. Francis kept a rotating circle of noble women, ladies-in-waiting, and aspiring courtesans within his inner sanctum. What distinguished his court wasn't just the number of romantic entanglements, but how stylized they were. The king enjoyed transforming seduction into ritual, a performance of power, charm, and rehearsal. Compliments became coded exchanges. Banquets became stages. And behind it all, the king played director, lead actor, and sole critic. Francis also had a tendency to publicly elevate certain favorites, male and female, bestowing titles, privileges, and access in ways that stirred endless court intrigue. To be chosen was to rise instantly. To fall out of favor was to disappear overnight. While some historians argue that Francis's court was no more scandalous than others of his era, what set his apart was its theatricality. It wasn't just debauchery, it was curated debauchery. Gossip became policy, romance became politics. The aesthetics of power were as important as the mechanics of it. In private, Francis was said to keep journals of his romantic encounters, not for shame, but for posterity, as if each liaison were a work of art worthy of annotation. And still, the court played along, because under Francis, to exist at court was to perform, and to perform well meant access, not just to favor, but to survival. But the next monarch wouldn't be so refined. His pleasures were far less poetic and far more performative, raw, loud, and orchestrated in public festivals that made the nobility wince and the clergy recoil. Because Ferdinand of Naples didn't just amuse himself, he made others perform his amusements, whether they wanted to or not. 19. Ferdinand of Naples. In the cluttered backroom of European monarchies, Ferdinand I of Naples was never the most powerful, nor the most celebrated. But he may well have been the most grotesquely inventive when it came to turning the rituals of rule into bizarre theatre. If some monarchs hid their vices behind silk curtains, Ferdinand dragged his into the daylight, costumed them in parody, and called it governance. Ferdinand ascended to the throne in 1759 and ruled during a period when Enlightenment ideals were sweeping through salons and academies. But Naples, under his direction, didn't receive the memo. His court rejected reason in favor of ritualized absurdity, with the king himself leading the charge. He was famously unrefined, a monarch who enjoyed hunting, fishing, and pranks more than philosophy or statecraft. But Ferdinand's eccentricities quickly crossed the line from rural charm into something darker and more theatrical. He had a fascination with watching others squirm, and a particular gift for transforming his amusements into spectacles of humiliation. Court records and diplomatic reports speak of entertainments staged by the king in which noble women were summoned, often under the guise of formal occasions, only to be roped into strange performative games. Dressed in elaborate costumes, they were made to act out scenes, perform dances, or engage in degrading skits designed not for their pleasure, but for the king's. These events were less soirees than pageants of controlled embarrassment, where Ferdinand played master of ceremonies, ringmaster, and delighted spectator. He also created what could only be described as a living theatre of obedience. Servants were not just ordered, they were directed like actors. Their roles changed depending on the king's mood. Sometimes they were forced to reenact folk tales or act out biblical parodies. Sometimes they were made to wear absurd uniforms or carry out public rituals with no purpose other than the king's personal amusement. The line between court and stage blurred entirely. Ferdinand's Naples became a kingdom where appearances mattered only as far as they contributed to the ongoing farce. And those who refused to participate in his amusements, they found themselves mysteriously excluded from dinners, from influence, and sometimes from court altogether. Even the clergy, usually safe behind their liturgical dignity, were not immune. Priests were mocked in elaborate charades, their sermons parodied in front of laughing nobles, while Ferdinand clapped like a schoolboy, delighted by his own mischief. But this wasn't just immature play, it was power, wielded with a smirk. The king's insistence on degrading performances was a twisted assertion of dominance, a reminder that everyone in his orbit danced to his tune, no matter how ludicrous the melody. And yet, for all the chaos, he remained in power for decades, because behind the buffoonery was real strategy, alliances, calculated tolerance of corruption, and just enough populist charm to keep revolts at bay. Ferdinand's court was a warning disguised as comedy, a monarchy reduced to cabaret, where dignity went to die, one performance at a time. You're right, I had already completed Ferdinand Wolse of Naples in the previous two-segment batch and mistakenly skipped ahead. Let's correct the sequence and return to the proper order. Here are the next two segments in strict continuation of your original list. For 20, Mughal Emperor Jahangir, India. In the grand marble tapestry of the Mughal Empire, Jahangir was the emperor who ruled with one hand on a wine cup and the other on a poet's quill. He inherited an empire of Persianate refinement and military prestige from his father Akbar the Great, a legacy as heavy as it was gilded. But Jahangir's reign was not a story of conquest or revolution. It was a long, spiraling tale of indulgence, opulence, and the slow erosion of clarity beneath a haze of self-designed rituals. From the beginning, Jahangir was a man of contradictions. He was obsessed with justice, commissioning a literal chain, the famous Zanjir-e-Adl, outside his palace for petitioners to ring in hope of royal intervention. He documented his reign in a meticulous autobiography, the Tuzuki Jahangiri, a rare feat in monarchic literature. And yet, for all his self-awareness, he slowly gave himself over to appetites he could name but not master. Wine and opium became more than habits. They became pillars of statecraft. Jahangir hosted elaborate durbars where the rituals of intoxication were woven into the rhythms of governance. Audiences were sometimes held under the influence, decrees issued with poetic flourish that later required revision or quiet erasure. While other rulers waged wars or pushed reforms, Jahangir designed new methods of distraction. His private life echoed the same Baroque excess. The imperial harem, already a vast institution under his father, swelled further under his command. But unlike the rigid, strategic structure of earlier emperors, Jahangir's harem was said to operate like a rotating gallery of indulgence. Accounts, particularly from Jesuit visitors and Persian chroniclers, described peculiar tests of loyalty, strange rotations of favorites, and courtiers selected for their beauty or novelty, rather than bloodline or alliance. And then there was Nur Jahan, his empress, whose presence often obscured Jahangir's own authority. While he drifted between wine-soaked evenings and opium-laced reflection, Nur Jahan issued firm orders, led diplomatic missions, and even minted coins in her name. To some, she was the power behind the throne. To others, she was the throne. The emperor seemed perfectly content with the arrangement. His interest in governance became episodic, his decrees poetic rather than practical. He saw no conflict in pursuing aesthetics while the machinery of state was run by others. In his mind, indulgence wasn't a distraction, it was a form of vision. But empires, unlike emperors, cannot float on perfume and poetry forever. The court grew restless, nobles plotted, his sons maneuvered for succession. And while Jahangir remained emperor in name, the weight of the crown shifted elsewhere, into the hands of those still grounded in the brutal reality of rule. When he died in 1627, he left behind an empire still intact but dimmed, like a great painting left too long in the sun. His legacy was not one of collapse, but of drift. And in that slow drift, he offered a warning. Even the grandest empire can lose itself if its ruler chooses beauty over ballast. But if Jahangir's indulgences were wrapped in incense and poetry, the next ruler would strip all pretense away. His empire was not a palace of art, but a prison of fear, where concubines drowned on a whim, and pleasure was indistinguishable from violence. Enter Sultan Ibrahim I, better remembered not as the delight of the world, but as Ibrahim the Mad. 21. Sultan Ibrahim IV of the Ottoman Empire, Ibrahim the Mad. There are monarchs whose madness is exaggerated, inflated by gossip, and sharpened by history's knife. And then there's Sultan Ibrahim I, whose reign was so erratic, so disturbingly theatrical, that even his contemporaries called him deluded in official reports. Ibrahim became sultan in 1640 under strange and fragile circumstances. He had spent most of his life imprisoned in the cafes, the Ottoman cage, a golden yet suffocating suite inside Topkapi Palace, where male heirs were confined to prevent dynastic coups. His brothers had been executed. He survived barely, and by the time he took the throne, he had already unraveled. What emerged was not a king, but a kind of storm. His first act of governance was not administrative, but deeply personal. He demanded his harem be expanded beyond comprehension. Hundreds of concubines were brought into the palace, not over time, but in waves. Historians say as many as 280 women were added in a single year, selected not for diplomacy, but for looks, novelty, and disturbingly, on bizarre physical criteria whispered about in the annals of the court. But what truly shocked the empire wasn't the scale, it was the instability. Ibrahim rotated favorites with unpredictable intensity, showered them with jewels one day and dismissed them the next, sometimes violently. One infamous story, which may be true, may be metaphor, and is horrifying either way, tells of Ibrahim ordering an entire section of his harem drowned in the Bosphorus on a whim, convinced of betrayal. Ottoman chroniclers tried to write around it. European envoys were less delicate. The harem under Ibrahim ceased to be a royal institution and became a vortex of paranoia, desire, and delusion. Servants were said to walk on eggshells, not out of etiquette, but out of fear. The women within lived in elaborate chambers, beneath painted ceilings, beside golden fountains, and yet it was not a pleasure palace. It was a trap. Ibrahim's obsessions expanded beyond the harem. He demanded silken clothes, rare perfumes, strange animals, and was once said to have filled entire rooms with furs, jewels, and fruit just to roll in them. These weren't whims, they were compulsions. He was not simply indulging, he was unraveling. The empire groaned under his rule. Ministers tried to contain him. The Janissaries muttered, and eventually it was his own mother, the formidable Kösem Sultan, who stepped in, orchestrating a palace coup to remove her son before he destroyed what remained of Ottoman dignity. Ibrahim was deposed in 1648 and later quietly executed, not with fanfare, but with weary relief. The empire, wounded but not broken, moved on. But the echo of his reign remained, a strange question carved into the palace walls. What happens when an empire breeds a monarch whose only command is desire? And that question would haunt the next ruler on our list. One who drank deeply from the same well of excess, but cloaked it in cruelty, not confusion. Sultan Murad IV was coming, and no one laughed under his rule. 22. Sultan Murad IV, Ottoman Empire. If Sultan Ibrahim V was chaos in silk robes, then Sultan Murad IV was order forged from terror, a man who wrapped his empire in silence and his pleasures in steel. Where his predecessor ruled by impulse and indulgence, Murad ruled by absolute force, tempering the Ottoman throne with one hand while holding a tankard of wine in the other, usually in secret and often just before sentencing someone to death for doing the same. Murad IV came to power in 1623, just 11 years old, installed as a puppet under the regency of his mother Kösem Sultan, a formidable figure in Ottoman history in her own right. The empire was in disarray, corruption was rife, the janissaries were mutinous, and regional governors acted like kings in their own provinces. Murad was expected to be pliable. He was not. By the time he took full control as an adult, he had watched the empire flirt with collapse and had no intention of letting it do so again. His response was as swift as it was brutal. An autocracy built on obedience, fear, and absolute moral contradiction. At the center of his reforms was a violent obsession with control, not just over the military or the government, but over behavior. He outlawed alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, considering them threats to public order and morality. The consequences for breaking these laws weren't fines or formal reprimands. They were death, and not symbolic death. Murad reportedly dressed in plain clothes, wandering the streets of Istanbul at night in disguise, hunting violators himself. The stories, part history, part cautionary tale, describe him discovering men smoking in back alleys or drinking behind shuttered doors and executing them on the spot. Sometimes he used his sword, sometimes his bare hands. One story claims he personally strangled a man for sipping coffee during prayer time. Whether literal or exaggerated, the message was clear. The Sultan saw everything and punishment was immediate. But while the streets of Istanbul echoed with fear and whispered prayers, the palace told a different story. Behind the walls of Topkapi, Murad's public morality dissolved into private indulgence. Despite his bans, he was said to drink heavily, favoring strong wine and even stronger reku. He threw lavish parties late into the night, entertained himself with musicians and storytellers, and surrounded himself with beautiful companions selected not for diplomacy, but for their ability to amuse. Servants and consorts alike were expected to perform, not just dance or sing, but entertain him in strange, sometimes humiliating games. The court became a stage, and Murad its only audience. His cruelty wasn't just functional, it was performative. He didn't just issue commands, he made them theatrical. Executions were sometimes public, and those closest to him lived in a state of permanent uncertainty. Ministers, friends, even family members could fall out of favor with a glance. And because Murad trusted no one, he created layers of surveillance, instructing his spies to monitor not only his enemies but his friends, and then report directly to him over breakfast. The contradiction at the heart of his reign, that a man so devoted to stamping out vice in his empire could be so addicted to it himself, was never questioned at court. To question was to disappear. He did bring stability for a time. Murad crushed the Janissaries, reasserted control over rebellious provinces, and launched a successful military campaign to retake Baghdad. He restored imperial authority through sheer force of will, but it came at a staggering cost: a court frozen by fear, a capital starved of joy, and an empire that learned to equate order with silence. His death in 1640 at the age of 27 came as abruptly as his rule had begun. Officially, it was due to cirrhosis, a quiet irony not lost on those who had watched him execute men for drinking. He left no heirs that mattered anyway. What Murad IV left behind was a kingdom secured by fear and hollowed out by it. His successors inherited an empire momentarily strong but spiritually vacant, a ghost palace where power had no warmth, only weight. But the Ottoman court was not finished writing its stranger chapters. If Murad turned vice into a death sentence, the next emperor would elevate indulgence into imperial policy, turning his palace into a vast and tireless carousel of carefully scheduled pleasure. Because far to the east, in the opulent courts of China's ancient dynasties, one man reigned whose appetites were so structured, so excessive, and so institutionalized that even Confucian officials, trained to withstand all things, were left speechless. That man was Emperor Yang of Sui, the son of a conqueror, the builder of grand canals, and the orchestrator of bedroom rotations that made even his palaces feel dizzy. 23. Emperor Yang of Sui, China. Few rulers have built their downfall as beautifully as Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty. He reigned over China in the early 7th century, a time of colossal engineering, imperial reunification, and poetic self-destruction. His roads were straight, his canals immense, his palaces glittering, and his appetites, according to scandalized Confucian chroniclers, ran on a timetable of exhausting precision. He was born Yang Guang, the second son of Emperor Wen, founder of the Sui dynasty. Though originally passed over for the throne, Yang's ambition proved sharper than birth order. Through a murky sequence of political maneuvering, which some records suggest included the suspiciously timely death of his older brother, Yang rose to the top. In 604 CE, he became the second emperor of the Sui, and that was when the architecture of indulgence truly began. Yang was, in many ways, a man of vast vision. Under his command, the Grand Canal was completed, one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in world history, connecting northern and southern China for the first time via a man-made artery of trade, troops, and imperial will. He toured his empire in enormous floating palaces, flanked by thousands of servants, oarsmen, and attendants. Entire regions were mobilized for his journeys. Cities were refitted, roads rebuilt, rivers reshaped, but for all his feats of engineering, Yang's rule was as notorious for its overreach as for its brilliance. Nowhere was this more evident than in his private life, which, far from being hidden, was ritualized, bureaucratized, and scheduled. Historical texts, particularly from Tang-era historians eager to paint the Sui as morally bankrupt, detail Yang's creation of what was essentially a rotational schedule for his imperial consorts. He maintained thousands of women in his harem, divided across multiple palaces, each built with architectural considerations tailored to his desires. These women were not merely decorative. They were organized into units, rotated by day, mood, or season, and summoned according to charts. It was said that special officials were assigned to manage the logistics of intimacy, not just matching partners to time slots, but maintaining records of preferences, durations, and even reactions. These rituals weren't secret. They were administered like any other bureaucratic function of the empire. The court's Confucian scholars, trained to catalogue the cosmos itself, found themselves forced to nod politely as palace servants filed reports on imperial bedroom timetables. Even in an era where emperors were considered semi-divine, this was a lot. But Yang didn't stop there. He commissioned entire pavilions dedicated to amusement, including artificial lakes with floating stages where dancers and musicians performed from dawn until collapse. He imported rare birds, exotic fruits, and foreign entertainers to turn his palaces into a sort of living museum of indulgence. One of his favorites, constructing pleasure gardens that mirrored mythological heavens, complete with sculpted clouds, jewel trees, and winding paths designed to confuse and delight. And through it all, the emperor sat, watching, summoning, discarding. While earlier emperors might have shrouded their private behavior in mystery, Yang institutionalized it. For him, the line between personal desire and state business simply didn't exist. If the emperor wanted pleasure, then so did the empire. If he needed distraction, then the empire must become distracting. If he grew tired, something or someone must be replaced. The real tragedy was that while he orchestrated endless pageantry behind palace walls, the empire outside was unraveling. His massive construction projects drained the treasury. Forced labor bred resentment. failed military campaigns against Korea pushed the people to revolt. In 618 CE, Yang fled the capital amid a wave of uprisings. Once surrounded by thousands of entertainers and servants, he now had only a dwindling band of loyalists. He was eventually strangled by his own generals in a quiet corner of the empire he once ruled like a living god. What he left behind was a broken dynasty, a battered people, and 1,000 scandalous stories that historians, blushing and fuming in equal measure, would preserve for centuries. Yang had transformed indulgence into governance, desire into routine, and luxury into imperial law. But even that wasn't his most unsettling legacy. It was the cold, machine-like efficiency with which it was all executed, as if human intimacy were no more than a form to be stamped, filed, and archived. But while Yang built palaces of decadence, the next emperor on our list would inherit a throne and immediately convert it into a stage. He wasn't interested in pleasure through ritual or dominance through spectacle. Emperor Wu of Jin wanted everything at once, and if history is to be believed, he very nearly got it. 24. Emperor Wu of Jin, China. In the long, winding gallery of imperial excess, Emperor Wu of Jin, also known as Sima Yan, built a reputation not just as a ruler who indulged, but as one who institutionalized decadence with such systematic enthusiasm that even the most sycophantic courtiers reportedly began to squirm. His reign marked the founding of the Western Jin dynasty in 266 CE. After decades of civil war and fragmentation, he was supposed to be the restorer of order, the calm after chaos, and in some sense he was, but the peace he brought came lacquered in gold, perfumed with wine, and padded with thousands of silk-covered pillows. Sima Yan had inherited a world weary of bloodshed. The fall of the Wei and the final end of the Three Kingdoms era had left China exhausted, traumatized, and deeply suspicious of ambition. When he rose to power, there was hope that he would stabilize the empire. And he did, at first. Administrative reforms, reunification policies, and a brief pause in warfare earned him early praise. But success for Emperor Wu was less a foundation and more an excuse. Once peace had been secured and rivals eliminated, he turned his imperial gaze inward, toward his own pleasures. It's said that his harem reached astronomical proportions. Over 10,000 women, carefully housed, catalogued and rotated across the many palatial compounds he had built or repurposed for this exact purpose. Unlike earlier emperors who kept large harems as symbols of dynastic strength, Emperor Wu used his as a living organism, a logistical challenge he seemed eager to solve. The problem of selection, for instance, was handled with imperial flair. According to multiple historical sources, Sima Yan, facing the logistical nightmare of choosing knightly companions from thousands of concubines, allegedly invented a transportation system to streamline the process. The women would be seated in small wheeled carts, or, depending on the translation, referred to as goat-drawn carriages, and wherever the goat stopped was where the emperor would spend the night. It was a kind of randomized intimacy by livestock. That story may be apocryphal, exaggerated by Confucian historians who were already horrified by the sheer scale of the emperor's indulgences. But even if the goats were metaphorical, the administrative effort behind his harem was not. Each woman had a designation, each encounter recorded, and many officials were employed in the management of the imperial household's private affairs. Pleasure in Emperor Wu's court was not spontaneous. It was scheduled. Rotations were tracked like tax records. Entry into the harem involved not just beauty, but recommendations, assessments, and an understanding of how to navigate the invisible politics of the bedchamber. Favor could mean elevation. Obscurity could mean permanent residence in one of the lesser palaces, never to be summoned again. And outside the harem, the rest of court life was not much more restrained. Banquets lasted for days. Rivers of wine reportedly flowed through artificial canals in the gardens, where golden cups were floated downstream for guests to catch and drink. Elaborate performances featuring dancers, acrobats, and dramatized myths played out nightly. There was no ceiling to the budget, no limit to the spectacle. Scholars were expected to praise, not critique. Ministers learned to smile and nod while the empire's coffers began to sag under the weight of the emperor's dreams. But perhaps most unsettling was how normalized it all became. Emperor Wu wasn't erratic like Ibrahim I, nor was he violent like Murad IV. He was, in many ways, polite, a lover of poetry, music, and beautiful things. His indulgences came not with rage or delusion, but with soft-spoken command. That made them harder to resist and even harder to question. Meanwhile, cracks began to show. The military, underfunded and underappreciated, began to falter. The aristocracy grew bloated and corrupt, and in the shadows of the palaces, his own family, including future heirs, started to turn on each other. The infamous War of the Eight Princes, a series of devastating civil conflicts between members of the royal family, would erupt shortly after his death and rip the Jin dynasty apart from the inside. By the time Emperor Wu passed in 290 CE, he left behind an empire unified in name but hollow in structure. He had brought peace, yes, but it was a peace so perfumed, so intoxicated by its own elegance that it crumbled at the first sign of internal strain. His legacy, a cautionary tale carved in jade and whispered in courtyards, that indulgence, when given the power of empire, will consume not only the emperor, but the state itself. But while Sima Yan turned his dynasty into a palace of distractions, the next king on our list would rule not with grace or poetry, but with the strange, stubborn theatricality of an isolated monarch trying to modernize a medieval nation. King Zogburst of Albania, the last mystery in our descent, didn't inherit a throne. He built one, and what he built around it was stranger than fiction. 25. King Zogwai of Albania. If you were to take the shattered leftovers of a crumbling Ottoman province, add a dash of Balkan drama, throw in a stack of European etiquette manuals, and mix it all with the ambition of a man who had never seen a throne but decided to invent one anyway, you'd get King Zogwai of Albania. Born Ahmet Muhtar Zogoli in 1895, Zog didn't grow up in a palace. He grew up in the highlands of northern Albania, where tribal loyalties mattered more than bloodlines, and the closest thing to royal authority was a well-armed cousin. By the age of 25, he was prime minister. By 33, president, and in 1928, after changing his name to Zog, he crowned himself king of the Albanians. That's not a metaphor. He held an actual coronation with an actual crown in a country that had never had a king before. So began the strange and storm-laced reign of King Zog, a ruler whose leadership was a blend of bravado, paranoia, state-building, and the kind of personal habits that had the European aristocracy raising their eyebrows from Vienna to London. Zog had a problem. Actually, he had several. His kingdom was poor, rural, and deeply fractured along tribal and religious lines. He had no royal lineage, no great army, no aristocratic court. What he had was style, nerve, and a very modern sense of how to turn authority into image. He dressed like a monarch, ordered handcrafted thrones, adopted royal symbols, and built elaborate palaces, even if the plumbing wasn't quite finished. But it wasn't the politics that shocked his contemporaries. It was the rumors. Whispers around European diplomatic circles painted King Zog as a man whose private life was one long chain of contradictions. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, but he did insist on being guarded at all times by heavily armed men, sometimes as many as 600 of them. He had survived over 50 assassination attempts and reportedly never went anywhere without at least 2 bodyguards within arm's reach. At banquets, they stood behind him. At meetings, they flanked him. At bedtime, according to persistent gossip, they remained nearby. But what caught the attention of the more gossipy tabloids wasn't just the security. It was the rumors that inside the palace, the king's taste for absolute control extended beyond matters of state. There were persistent reports, never formally confirmed but widely circulated, that Zog maintained strict behavioral expectations for the women of his court, particularly those working inside the palace. Staff were said to be instructed in dress, manner, and even in how to converse with the king. Servants allegedly rehearsed how to speak in his presence. Some accounts claim that women selected for court roles underwent interviews so exacting they bordered on absurd. A misplaced glance or informal tone could be grounds for dismissal. There were other stories too, that Zog had a hidden chamber inside the palace for private interviews, that he rotated his personal attendants with suspicious frequency, that only a select few were ever allowed into his residential wing, and even fewer allowed out without swearing silence. None of these tales were ever substantiated, and Zog's supporters dismissed them as political slander. But the rumors had traction for one reason: they fit the man. Zog was known for projecting imperial confidence while living in a country without imperial infrastructure. His court had the trappings of royalty: velvet thrones, banquets, uniforms, but little of the tradition or restraint that came with older dynasties. It was an experiment in monarchy, performed in real time, on unstable ground, with a king who seemed increasingly determined to control everything he could, no matter how small. In 1938, Zog married Countess Geraldine Apponyi de Nagy-Apponyi, a Hungarian aristocrat. The wedding was a diplomatic gesture as much as a personal one, an attempt to legitimize his reign in the eyes of skeptical Europeans. But even then, the court remained strange. Foreign visitors reported that everything in the palace felt tense, rehearsed, and oddly theatrical. The royal family may have smiled, but the smiles never quite reached the corners of the room. In 1939, with Mussolini eyeing Albania like a snack, Zog fled into exile. He would spend the rest of his life in various European cities, trying and failing to reclaim his throne. He died in Paris in 1961, still calling himself King of the Albanians. What he left behind was a monarchy built from scratch, held together by ceremony, guarded by machine guns, and haunted by rumors of a private life so meticulously controlled that no one ever truly knew where the image ended and the man began. And so, the curtain falls on the last royal in our procession. But of course, if history teaches us anything, it's that curtains never fall cleanly. Behind every throne, behind every rumor, behind every velvet-draped scandal, something always lingers. A question, a shadow, a whisper in the marble halls. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not what these royals did behind closed doors, but why so many were so desperate to build the door in the first place.